Section 3 of Imperialism and World Politics, Part 3 of 4, by Parker Thomas Moon. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Read by Alistair. Chapter 14a, The Battle of Concessions in the Far East, Part 1. A century or so ago, Napoleon Bonaparte, with one of his characteristic flashes of intuition, remarked of China, "There lies a sleeping giant. Let him sleep, for when he wakes he will move the world." The China of which he spoke was the dense mass of 300 million human beings, patiently cultivating the valleys and rich alluvial plains of Eastern Asia, reverently worshipping their ancestors, and preserving their ancient culture, scorning all things foreign or novel, too much absorbed in the eternal realities of work and love and children and friends and family, too much accustomed to local and individual liberty, and too placidly certain of the unconquerable massiveness of their race and civilization, to be much agitated by the fears or the ambitions of smaller nations, or much concerned by the fact that their emperor and their bureaucracy were of the alien Manchu race. Invasions of the past had been mere pinpricks. Invaders were slowly but surely assimilated. China was the eternal kingdom, the celestial empire, around which other peoples gravitated like planets in subservient orbits. China proper included, besides the thickly peopled lowlands, a back country of hills and mountains, little cultivated, but stored well with unworked mineral treasures. All in all, it was a country half as big as the United States is today, but around China proper lay dependent provinces, Xinjiang, Manchuria, Mongolia, Tibet, which in themselves made up an area as large as the United States, and, besides, the neighbouring kingdoms of Korea, Annam and Tonkin, and Burma, and even the island empire of Japan paid tribute and homage, or had occasionally done so, to the great empire from which all had obtained no small part of their culture. Surrounded by vassals and tributaries, China was truly a giant grown drowsy in centuries of unquestioned supremacy. Europe woke the giant. The result may be best put in the words of a discerning American Secretary of State, John Hay. "The storm center of the world has shifted to China." He added, "Whoever understands that mighty empire has a key to world politics for the next 5 centuries. The first task of our inquiry, however, is not to understand China, but to discover what Europe did to China and the surrounding nations of the Far East, and for what purposes, because the Far East is today a melting pot in which Orient and Occident are being fused, in which the familiar saying, East is East and West is being hourly disproved. The Far East, to revert to Hay's metaphor, is the storm centre of the world, because the West has invaded the East. Subsection: Opening the door for merchants and missionaries. Why Europe invaded the Far East may be simply stated. European industrial nations and the United States desired first of all an open door for their merchants, mariners, and missionaries, especially their merchants. This was the reason for the opening up of China, Japan, and Korea in the period from 1840 to about 1880. This was not true imperialism. On the contrary, the open door is almost the opposite of imperialism. But the opening of the Far East led inevitably to a desire for monopoly of markets, mines, and railway building, hence for monopolistic spheres of influence, and also for naval bases, and in some cases territory. This was genuine imperialism, and it has been the dominant factor in the Far East since the 1880s. The early commercial motive and the later imperialism both required the use of force, but in their effects they were unlike. The former meant wars without conquests, the latter conquests and bitter international rivalry. The open door had to be opened by violence or by threat, for Asia in the 19th century did not welcome the trade and the creed of the West. A few European merchants, it is true, were permitted to buy silk and tea, or sell opium from India, at Canton in China, and similarly with Japan a few shiploads of goods were exchanged each year. But with these minor exceptions, the empires of Eastern Asia were as effectively closed to the outside world as if they had been surrounded on every side by impenetrable walls. they were surrounded by walls not of stone, but of prejudice, self-sufficiency, conservatism. The first important breach in the wall of exclusiveness was made by the Anglo-Chinese War of 1839 through 42, often called the Opium War. A commissioner of the Chinese government, Lin Zexu, determined to put an instant end to the opium trade, demanded that the British merchants at Canton surrender the stocks of opium which they had there for sale. When the British refused, he put the British community in Canton under quarantine and brought it almost to starvation. This was one immediate cause of the war. Moreover, British sailors in quest of excitement had happened to kill a Chinese. Commissioner Lin had demanded the surrender of the murderer. The British had refused. Lin threatened to make the arrest by force, and the British naval squadron opened fire on the Chinese fleet in November 1839. This was the immediate occasion of the war. The real issue was the commercial open door. Much to Commissioner Lin's surprise, the barbarians upon whom he looked with ineffable contempt proved amazingly powerful in war. British warships easily captured several cities on the Chinese coast, and the terms of peace were dictated by the British in the Treaty of Nanking, 1842, and supplementary agreements. China paid an indemnity. 5 Chinese cities, Canton, Shanghai, Amoy, Fuchu, and Ningpo, were to be treaty ports, in which British and other foreign merchants could freely trade and reside and erect their warehouses. Near Canton, the small island of Hong Kong was ceded to Great Britain, in order that British merchants might have a secure place for warehouses and residences. Moreover, British citizens residing in the treaty ports were to be subject to British rather than Chinese law, and were to be judged by British consuls. This exemption of foreigners from the laws of the country is called extraterritoriality. It is difficult to see how Europeans could have resided in China without some such arrangement, for Chinese law and Chinese punishments were incomprehensible and seemed barbarous to foreigners. Footnote: Chinese patriots are now eager to abolish extraterritoriality as a restriction on Chinese sovereignty and a reflection on Chinese courts and laws. An international conference met in January 1926 to discuss this problem. See Discussion in American Relations with China, Johns Hopkins Press, 1925, page 49. End footnote. One other important provision of the peace settlement was that British goods imported into China would no longer be subject to arbitrary exactions, but to a fixed customs tariff, the rate of which was later settled at 5% ad valorem. Thus China lost the right to regulate her own tariff. The Nanking Treaty and its supplements were inspired clearly by a British desire for free access to the Chinese market, but not by latter-day imperialism. Great Britain could have taken a large slice of territory. She was content with the tiny island of Hong Kong. She could have asked for exclusive privileges. She was willing that other nations enjoy the same rights. By separate treaties with China, the United States and France in 1844, and other powers in later years, obtained the same rights that England enjoyed in the treaty ports. 3 results of this first step toward opening China are worth noting. First, European trade with China increased marvellously, thereby intensifying the European interest in China. Second, the treaty port privileges made it safer for European missionaries to work in China. Incidentally, there was in the 50s a great rebellion, the Taiping Rebellion, led by a pretender who had been converted to Christianity. The feelings of the Chinese emperor may easily be imagined. Third, the contact of European merchants and missionaries inevitably produced friction and conflict. In the treaty ports, the Europeans lived in peril, surrounded by a hostile Chinese population. Chinese officials were arrogant and overbearing. A French missionary was executed on the charge of stirring up rebellion. A ship flying the British flag was boarded by Chinese officials, who sought the arrest of one of the Chinese crew, a murderer. The latter incident led to a second Anglo-Chinese War in 1857. And France too made war on China. Again China was defeated, and to save the capital from capture, the Chinese government hastily made peace by the Treaty of Tianjin, 1858, promising 1. To throw open additional treaty ports, 2. To permit trade on the Yangtze River and travel in the interior, 3. To permit a British ambassador or minister to reside at Peking, 4. To revise the 1843 schedule of customs duties, which now amounted to more than 5% since prices had dropped, and which the British wished to restore to an effective 5%. And 5. To refrain from molesting Christian missionaries and converts. The last point was quaintly phrased. The Christian religion, as professed by Protestants or Roman Catholics, inculcates the practice of virtue and teaches man to do as he would be done by. Persons teaching or professing it, therefore, shall alike be entitled to the protection of the Chinese authorities. France, United States, and Russia promptly received similar rights by treaties made at Tianjin in 1858. When a British minister started up the Peiho River to Peking to get the Treaty of Tianjin ratified by the Emperor, he found a chain stretched across the river, and his ships were bombarded. This, of course, was, from the European point of view, an outrage. English and French forces were sent to punish the outrage. Peking was attacked, and the imperial summer palace was burned. Unable to resist such European methods of persuasion, the Chinese Emperor now confirmed the Tianjin treaties, added an indemnity, and gave Great Britain a small area on the mainland near Hong Kong for the expanding British commercial community there. During the Chinese conflict with England and France, Russia had been represented to China as the protector and friend of China. As a reward, Russia received, by the treaties of 1858 and 1860, all Chinese territory north of the Amur River and east of the Ussuri River, a vast region which became the maritime province of Russian Siberia. The Russian aggression was inspired partly by the expansion of Russian colonization from Siberia into the Amur Valley, and partly by the traditional Russian desire for an ice-free port. In the annexed territory, Russia found an admirable harbour, which became the port and naval base of Vladivostok, free of ice during many months of the year. The other European powers, however, were less interested in territorial expansion at this time. They wanted simply the open door, and they were willing that it should be equally open for all. What they wanted, and what they had obtained between 1840 and 1860, may be summarised as 1. The right to trade at certain treaty ports, 2. A fixed, low tariff, 3. Extraterritorial rights, 4. Toleration for missionaries. Compare the case of China with that of Japan. Japan likewise had been a hermit nation, with doors closed to Europe. Japan likewise was forced to admit foreigners and their trade, but the results were very different. Not England, but the United States took the initiative with Japan. Like other nations, the United States had resented the refusal of Japan to permit trade, or to receive diplomatic envoys, but the Americans had a special grievance. Occasionally American whaling vessels were shipwrecked on the Japanese coast, and the sailors were imprisoned, sometimes tortured. Hoping to stop this sort of thing, and at the same time open up the island empire for American trade as China had been opened, President Fillmore in 1853 sent Commodore Perry with a letter addressed to the ruler of Japan, and many presents typical of Western civilization: firearms, a toy railway, telegraph instruments, books, champagne, and many barrels of whiskey. When Perry's 4 warships steamed into Tokyo Bay, black smoke pouring from their funnels, the Japanese were terrified at the strange sight, and fled to their temples to pray for deliverance. But Perry landed, interviewed the officials, expressed his desire to conclude a treaty, and, on being refused, announced that after they had time to think it over, he would return for an answer with more warships. True to his word, he came back in 1854 with 10 ships, and obtained a treaty allowing American ships to anchor in 2 Japanese ports, and obtain provisions, and promising hospitable treatment of shipwrecked sailors. Immediately afterward, the United States sent as Consul General to Japan Townsend Harris, a man of such independence that he refused to crawl on his hands and knees, as had been the custom, before the Japanese ruler, and of such ability that he soon negotiated treaties granting Americans many new privileges and opening Nagasaki and Yokohama to American trade. Other nations followed suit. In Japan, as in China, treaty ports were opened, the customs duties were fixed by treaty, and extraterritorial jurisdiction conferred on foreign consuls. Korea, like Japan and China, was also compelled to open its ports. This mountainous kingdom, the hermit kingdom of the East, somewhat bigger than New England, and twice as densely populated, had excluded foreign trade and put to death adventurous missionaries, despite French and American punitive expeditions. But when the Koreans fired on some Japanese sailors, Japan used the tactics which Commodore Perry had taught her, and forced upon Korea in 1876 a treaty opening a Korean port to Japanese traders. Similar treaties with other nations completed the work, and soon Korea was much in the same position as China and Japan as regards treaty ports and extraterritorial rights. In all three countries, the first contacts with the merchants, missionaries, gunners and diplomatists who represented Western civilization produced profoundly disquieting effects. In China, a convert to Christianity became the leader of the Taiping Rebellion, whose object was to overthrow the Manchu emperor, and only by employing a British adventurer, Major Charles Gordon, to lead the imperial troops did the Chinese government suppress the insurrection after more than a decade of civil war. After that, the Manchu officials in China generally regarded foreigners, especially missionaries, with suspicion and hatred, while despite official hostility, many Chinese, especially in the southern treaty ports which had first been opened, came under the influence of European ideas. The smouldering enmity between South China and North, between Chinese and Manchu, was thus intensified. In Korea, Western ideas were accepted by a number of influential leaders who became progressives, while other factions at the royal court cherished a bitter resentment toward the intruders from abroad. The conservatives and exclusionists found sympathy and some support at the hands of the Chinese government, whereas the progressives looked to the Americans and to the Japanese, for Japan embraced European civilization with gusto. Japan at first experienced the same internal conflict between progressives and exclusionists that occurred in China and Korea, but the progressives triumphed brilliantly. A little explanation is necessary. Before 1867, Japan was a feudal monarchy, whose nominal sovereign, the Mikado, or emperor, dwelt at his imperial city of Kyoto, and whose actual ruler, the shogun, or regent, greatest of the nobles, governed the nation from his capital at Yedo. Feudalism was rampant. The country was divided into small provinces, each ruled by a noble chieftain, and each chieftain had his loyal band of swordsmen, samurai they were called, who, like the knights of medieval Europe, prided themselves on chivalric standards of honour, wore their arms as a badge of nobility, and scorned manual labour. The common people who tilled the soil were comparable to the serfs of the Middle Ages. To the Japanese feudal system, the coming of Perry and the opening of Japan proved fatal. First, the shogun, who signed the treaty with Perry, and who admitted the foreigners, was denounced by the leading nobles, especially those of the Satsuma and Choshu clans in southern Japan, who had long been jealous of the shogun's power, and who now accused him of cowardice. But the chieftains themselves soon had a taste of Europe's power. It so happened that a procession of the Satsuma chieftain and his retainers was interrupted by 3 Englishmen, who discourteously tried to break through, and were promptly cut down by an indignant Satsuma swordsman. But the guns of a British squadron showed the Satsuma clan that European civilization was irresistible. The Prince of Choshu had a similar experience. By firing on foreign ships, his retainers provoked England, France, the United States, and Holland to such a point that they sent warships to demolish his forts, punish his insolence, and exact an indemnity of $3 million. Choshu and Satsuma ceased to stand for exclusion, but they became the more determined to oust the shogun, who seemed incapable of protecting the country. Other nobles, too, became convinced that the dual government and divided allegiance must be ended, and the emperor restored to power if Japan were to survive. Finally, in 1867, the shogun was overthrown by the nobles, and the young Mikado, Matsuhito, then only 15 years old, was restored to full power. This revolution or restoration was the turning point for Japan. The boy emperor allowed the government henceforth to be conducted by a little group of patriotic nobles and knights, chiefly of the Satsuma and Choshu clans, who were determined to resist European aggression by adopting European civilization. Most of them were ambitious young men under 30 years of age. With a courage and a sagacity that would be hard to excel, these young men transformed Japan. Henceforth Europeans were welcomed, treated courteously by the imperial court, and studiously imitated. Englishmen were employed to direct the construction of railways, telegraph lines, lighthouses. French legal experts supervised the reform of the legal and judicial system, so that Japan could regain the right to try foreigners in her own courts. Americans helped organise a postal system and improved agricultural methods. Germans were drafted for the preparation of commercial laws, the reorganisation of local government, and the teaching of medicine. After he had visited Europe to study Western methods of government, Prince Ito drafted a constitution, 1889, establishing an aristocratic House of Peers and a not-too-democratic House of Representatives with carefully restricted powers. Factories began to spring up. Ships were built for foreign trade. The feudal lords were persuaded to make voluntary surrender of their fiefs, so that feudalism could be replaced by more efficient modern government. The samurai laid aside their swords with magnificent self-sacrifice, and in their place a new fighting force, a modern army of conscripted commoners, was organised by French, later German officers, equipped with European rifles and cannon, and drilled in European methods. The new army, distrusted at first, proved its value by defeating 30,000 rebellious samurai of Satsuma in a bloody civil war. There was also a navy. Japan had hitherto possessed none. Warships were purchased from England, and a fleet was organised under British guidance, until Japan could build arsenals and navy yards of her own. Unquestionably, Japan's sudden transformation was in some respects as insincere as the adoption of European clothes. Japanese officials might wear European costumes in the daytime, and might have mansions furnished in mid-Victorian style, but in the privacy of family life they wore the graceful garments of their ancestors and remained loyal to Japanese customs. It was chiefly the military and economic institutions of the West that were copied. As an indication of the imperviousness of Japanese to Western spiritual ideals, the very small success of Christian missions among the Japanese is significant. Subsection: The Sino-Japanese War. Such were the first fruits of the opening of the Far East. Later came imperialism. Toward the close of the 19th century, European powers began to seek something more than commercial opportunity in Asia. France began to encroach on Chinese territory from the south by conquering Annam and Tonkin in the 80s, despite Chinese claims of suzerainty over those regions. Great Britain annexed Burma. Russia built a railway through Siberia and began to covet China's northern Manchurian provinces, and Japan, taking a leaf from Europe's book, marked Korea for her spoil. Japan's intervention in Korea in 1894 was at once the natural result of the events and the prelude to a fierce outburst of international imperialist rivalry. In Korea, the incoming European ideas had created two factions, as we have seen, a progressive faction fostered by the Japanese, and an anti-European faction favoured by the Chinese government. Court intrigues, conspiracies, and acts of violence growing out of the rivalry between the factions were bound to involve China and Japan. In Korea, the Japanese principle of assimilating Europeanism was opposed to Chinese conservatism. A crisis was reached in 1894, when, at the appeal of the Korean royal family, China dispatched a regiment or two to Korea, and Japan, not to be outdone, sent 12,000 men to occupy the capital and treaty ports. It was unlikely that China would accept Japan's polite proposal that both powers should undertake to guide Korea into the path of progress. On the contrary, China revived her claims to suzerainty over Korea. Japanese forces entered the Korean royal palace, installed the king's father as regent. The regent promptly declared war on China in July 1894. Though the Chinese had some Krupp guns and modern rifles and ironclad warships, they were overconfident, ill-organised, inefficient. In less than a year, the Japanese had overrun Korea and southern Manchuria, and were threatening Peking. It was a striking lesson in the value of Europeanization. By the peace treaty of Shimonoseki, April 17, 1895, China recognized the absolute independence of Korea. This allowed the Japanese in the role of advisors to dominate the Korean government, and promised an indemnity of about 200 million taels, or about $150 million, more than enough to reimburse Japan for the total monetary cost of the war, and ceded to Japan the great island of Formosa and the smaller Pescadores Islands. But most important of all was the provision for the cession to Japan of the Liaotung Peninsula, from the southern tip of Manchuria, commanding the entry to the Gulf of Zhuli and Peking. Was the island empire of Japan to gain a foothold on the Chinese mainland? Hardly had the treaty been ratified when Russia, Germany, and France presented a joint note at Tokyo, offering their friendly advice to Japan to refrain from annexing any part of the Chinese mainland. Rather than risk an unequal war, Japan took the advice and returned Liaotung, and received 30 million taels as additional indemnity. Superficially, it appeared that three chivalrous Western powers had courteously protected China, yet in drab reality, these three intervening powers were anything but chivalrous in their motives. Russian imperialists felt that Korea and the Liaotung Peninsula were of vital importance to Russia. If Japan dominated Korea, Japan would control both sides of the southern outlet of the Japan Sea, on which was situated the Russian port of Vladivostok, the intended terminus of the Trans-Siberian Railway. If Japan annexed Liaotung, there would be no possibility of Russia's obtaining an ice-free port farther south, say Port Arthur. Japan, therefore, must be ousted from these regions. France joined with Russia as a loyal ally in world politics. It was less natural that Germany should have participated in the Triple Intervention, but the publication of the so-called Willy-Nicky correspondence between William II and Nicholas II has shown that the German Emperor was egging the Russian Tsar on against the Yellow Peril. Christendom, said the Kaiser, must stand firm against the pagan Orient. From the pen of a ruler who a few years later proclaimed himself the friend of the Mohammedans, such sentiments smack of insincerity. But there can be little doubt that what the Kaiser really desired was to promote cordial relations with Russia, and by showing himself more zealous than France as a friend of Russian imperialism, to weaken the Franco-Russian alliance and rob it of its anti-German sting. Moreover, the memoirs of the Kaiser and of von Tirpitz admit, and German documents prove, that at this time the German government eagerly coveted a Far Eastern naval base. The three great powers that had befriended China in the spring of 1895 were not unwilling to accept compensation for their aid. Indeed, China's friends were more grasping than the enemy from whom they saved her. France, for her part, by a convention signed June 20th, 1895, obtained an option on all mines in the three southern provinces adjoining French Indochina, and the right to extend French railways from Annam up into China, and confirmation of a reduction of the tariff by 30% to 40% on trade across the French Indochinese border. To the Chinese statesman Li Hongzhang, these privileges might not have seemed dangerous. To the student of imperialism, they appear as the familiar methods of economic penetration, the prelude to territorial annexation. Russian diplomats reminded Li Hongzhang that chiefly to Russia was China's preservation due. After a visit to Russia, Li Hongzhang was persuaded to authorize in 1896 a Russian-Chinese bank with largely French capital to aid the Chinese government in arranging the payments on the Japanese indemnity and to acquire concessions for the construction of railways and telegraphs. In September of the same year, the Russian-Chinese bank obtained an extremely important railway concession. The Chinese Eastern Railway was to be built straight across the Manchurian provinces of China, connecting with the Russian Trans-Siberian. As a glance at the map will show, this meant that instead of constructing the eastern section of the Trans-Siberian by a circuitous route through Russian territory, Russia would build it by a shorter, direct route through Chinese territory to the Vladivostok terminus. China was to give the right-of-way through public lands free and exempt the railway property and receipts from taxation, as Turkey did in the case of the Baghdad line, but China issued no bonds to finance the railway. In this case, a railway company was to be formed by Russian and Chinese, by way of courtesy, capital, the company's bonds being guaranteed by the Russian government. The last mentioned provision points to the political nature of the enterprise. Nominally a private industrial project, it was really an imperialist move on the part of the Russian government. The railway was, first and foremost, a strategic railway to advance Russian imperialist interests in the Far East. It would facilitate the movement of Russian troops in case of war, and even in time of peace Russian military guards could be stationed along the line to preserve order. Russia would dominate Manchuria from the military point of view. From the economic standpoint also, Manchuria would be Russified. Of course, the railway would give Russia the commerce of central and northern Manchuria. In addition, the company was to have mining rights along the route. Moreover, goods imported or exported over this railway would enjoy a reduction of a third of the established tariff rate. Russia's next step would be to get a concession for the southern extension of the line and a warm water port, for Vladivostok was icebound several months of the year. Subsection: the leased ports. Germany, meanwhile, had been inactive, but German experts had been considering which port on the Chinese coast would be most desirable as a Far Eastern naval base, and had selected Qingdao, on Jiaozhou Bay, on the southern coast of Shantung Peninsula. Though the Russians had earmarked Qingdao for themselves, in 1897 the German Emperor, in his most casual and friendly manner, obtained the Russian Tsar's approval of the German plan: Qingdao for Germany and Port Arthur for Russia. By a coincidence that well suited German ambitions, 2 German missionaries happened to be murdered in November 1897 by Chinese in Shantung, the very province which had been selected as the stage for German imperialism. Promptly the Kaiser sent Prince Henry of Prussia with a German squadron to display the German mailed fist in such a manner as to inspire respect for Germans in China. That the Kaiser, a Protestant, should have been so energetic in avenging the murder of Roman Catholic missionaries was a little surprising, but when Prince Henry proceeded to anchor in Jiaozhou Bay and land troops on its shores, and when Germany demanded a lease of that bay, the German government's motives became clear. Germany intended to get her place in the sun, her share of the spoils in China. The German method was ingenious. Instead of annexing Jiaozhou, Germany asked merely for a lease of the shores of the bay, about 200 square miles, for 99 years, during which period Germany could fortify and administer the leased territory as if it were hers. At Qingdao on the bay, Germany constructed a first-class fortified naval base and commercial port. All the advantages of annexation were obtained without the appearance of territorial greed, but Jiaozhou Bay was not only to be a naval base. It was to serve as an opening for German economic interests. German capitalists were to build 2 railways in the province of Shantung and exploit the mines found near the railways, within 30 li from each side, and for public works in Shantung, China would give preference to German capital and materials. In short, Shantung province was to be an economic sphere of influence for Germany. The leased port method was eagerly borrowed from Germany by other powers. Russia lost no time in obtaining a lease of 538 square miles for 25 years on the tip of the Liaotung Peninsula. In this area the harbour of Danyi was improved for commercial use, and Port Arthur was converted into a supposedly impregnable fortress and naval base. Furthermore, Russia was allowed to build a branch railway through southern Manchuria, connecting Port Arthur and Dalny with the Chinese eastern, that is to say the Trans-Siberian. Thus, Russia obtained an ice-free terminus for the Trans-Siberian. More than that, Port Arthur commanded the entrance to the Gulf of Chuli, and was within striking distance of the Chinese capital, Peking. Russia's leasehold, it may be remarked, included part of the very region which Russia had prevented Japan from annexing in 1895. Germany's lease of Jiaozhou was signed on March 6, 1898, Russia's lease of Port Arthur on March 27th. France came next. On the day after the signature of the Jiaozhou lease, France put in her successful demand for a lease of about 190 square miles, for 99 years, on the shores of Zhanjiang Bay in southern China, near the border French Indochina. Nor was Great Britain ignored. Great Britain presently obtained a lease of 400 square miles, near Hong Kong, and a lease of Weihaiwei on the northern coast of the Shantung Peninsula. The English purpose was to have a naval station conveniently near Port Arthur as a check on Russian aggression in the Far East, as the terms of the lease show, for England was to hold Weihaiwei as long as Russia remained in Port Arthur. Italy demanded a naval base too, but was refused. The year 1898, to sum up, was a year of leases in the Far East. 4 European great powers had obtained leased ports: Germany in Jiaozhou Bay, Russia in Port Arthur, France in Zhanjiang Bay, and England in Weihaiwei. As each leased port was intended to serve as a naval base, it is clear that the strategic situation in the Far East was becoming tense. But strategic naval bases were not so much objects in themselves as trappings of economic imperialism. The great powers were entrenching themselves for the contest over the trade and resources of China. Subsection: the Battle of Concessions. the economic aspect of the Far Eastern situation was taking on a new aspect. No longer were European powers seeking merely admission to the commerce of the Far East. That commerce had grown so rapidly that it was now of immense value, and European capitalism was beginning to reach out after the commerce of the interior of China, which could be reached and developed only by rivers and canals or railways. The first railway was built in 1876 and torn up, but others were constructed. Building a railway into the interior involves a capital investment that must be protected against disorder and banditry. It naturally tends to give the constructing power a monopoly of the commerce of the region, and as railway companies often receive mining rights, a railway concession meant much more than the laying of tracks. Furthermore, if capitalists of one country build a railway to open up a certain region, they do not wish capitalists of another country to construct a competing line into the same region. For instance, when in 1898 Great Britain obtained the lease-of-way highway, she informed Germany that there was no intention of competing with German railway construction in the province of Shantung. Railway building thus led naturally to the marking out of spheres of interest. France, as we have seen, laid claim to the 3 southern provinces of China, south of the Yangtze Valley, as her sphere for railway construction and mines, as early as 1895. Germany in 1898 obtained railway and mining rights in Shantung, which made that province a German sphere. In fact, by an Anglo-German agreement of September 1st and 2nd, 1898, British financial interests formally recognised the German right to a monopoly of railway construction in Shantung and the Hoangho Valley, in exchange for German recognition of a British monopoly in the Yangtze Valley and the province of Shanxi, north of the Yangtze and just west of Shantung, which was needed to connect the Yangtze with Peking and North China. Similarly, Great Britain and Russia agreed not to compete, but only after a lively contest, which is worth summarising here. In 1897, a Belgian syndicate obtained a concession to connect Peking in North China with Hankou on the Yangtze by rail, and it was reported later that Belgian interests were to build railways across central China from east to west. The meaning of this concession becomes clear when it is explained that the Belgian syndicate was acting in conjunction with French and Russian interests. Operating through this Belgian syndicate, Franco-Russian finance would construct a great system of railways dominating central China and connecting the Russian railways in the north with the French in the south of China. It would also cut across the British sphere in the Yangtze Valley. With extraordinary heat, the British Foreign Minister Lord Salisbury instructed the British minister at Peking to protest that
a concession of this nature is no longer a commercial or industrial enterprise and becomes a political movement against the British interests in the region of the Yangtze. You should inform the Sangli Yamen,
that is, the Chinese government,
that Her Majesty's government cannot possibly continue to cooperate in a friendly manner in matters of interest to China if, while preferential advantages are conceded to Russia in Manchuria and to Germany in Shantung, these or other powers should also be offered special openings or privileges in the region of the Yangtze.
When China, not daring to offend France and Russia, sanctioned the Belgian concession for the Peking-Hankou line, the British fleet was menacingly concentrated, and Mr. Balfour instructed the British minister at Peking to demand reparation in the form of concessions for British capital, and to threaten that if such concessions were refused,
we shall regard their,
that is, China's,
breach of faith concerning the Peking-Hankou Railway as an act of deliberate hostility against this country, and shall act accordingly.
This was indeed a strange method of obtaining Chinese consent to business propositions supposedly designed to benefit China. It was a threat of war. It put the British fleet at the service of British financiers in China. And in what Lord Salisbury called the Battle of Concessions, Great Britain's method proved successful. China agreed to concessions for about 2,800 miles of railway, longer than the German Baghdad Railway in Turkey or the Russian line in Manchuria, to be constructed by British capital. The lines projected by the British would cross 10 of China's 21 provinces, including Shanxi and Henan, which were then considered to be very rich in minerals. As one of the lines in which British capital was interested would run from Peking to Yingkou in Manchuria, Penetrating the Russian sphere, the Russians became alarmed and warm protests were exchanged between Petrograd and London. Finally, in April 1899, England and Russia came to an agreement, which may be quoted as a sample of its kind.
1. Great Britain engages not to seek for her own account, or on behalf of British subjects or of others, any railway concessions to the north of the Great Wall of China, and not to obstruct directly or indirectly applications for railway concessions in that region supported by the Russian government. 2. Russia on her part engages not to seek for her own account, or on the behalf of Russian subjects or of others, any railway concessions in the basin of the Yangtze, and not to obstruct directly or indirectly applications for railway concessions in that region supported by the British government.
It was a strange mixture of business and politics, all the negotiation about railway construction. In most cases, the primary factor was the desire of a group of capitalists to obtain the diplomatic backing of its own government in order to secure profitable contracts and ward off foreign competitors. Thus, in 1898, the manager of the Hong Kong and Shanghai Banking Corporation, a British concern, wrote a letter to the British Foreign Office announcing that a syndicate of British capitalists was to be formed, and asking that the British minister at Peking should be instructed to give them such support as they may require in obtaining railway concessions from the Chinese government. It is significant that before making this plea, the bank had hitherto worked with the German syndicate for the construction of railways in China, but, in order to enlist the aid of the British Foreign Office, it severed its German connection, and represented itself as the champion of British rather than international financial interests. Thus finance became nationalised, at least to a degree sufficient for the purpose of gaining national support. As a matter of fact, it was impossible to avoid some entanglement. Railways built by British capital and those built by German capital had to cooperate, to some extent, and in one of the biggest British railway ventures in China, Italian capitalists enjoyed an interest. Indeed, from an economic point of view, it was a sad mistake to regard Chinese railways as separate British, German, French or Russian ventures. It would have been to the economic benefit of all concerned had the railways of China been planned as mutually dependent links in a unified system, laid out so as to develop the country in the most efficient way. But the banking concerns competing for Chinese railway contracts were less interested in the economic welfare of the whole country and ultimate profitability of the railway system than in the immediate advantage of obtaining for themselves big concessions by enlisting diplomatic aid. And diplomats readily joined hands with the bankers and made the gaining of a concession, as Lord Salisbury said, not a purely industrial proposition, but a political matter. The diplomats went further. Not content with marking out a sphere of interest in which its own capitalists would have a monopoly of railways and mines, each government looked beyond to the day when economic partition would be followed by territorial partition of China. For example, France in 1898 obtained from China a promise never to cede or lease any part of the 3 southern provinces and the island of Hainan to any power other than France. England obtained a similar pledge regarding the provinces in the Yangtze Basin. In other words, each regarded its sphere of interest as the part of China which would fall to its lot when and if China should be dismembered. Russia would have Manchuria and all the territory north of the Great Wall, Germany Shantung, France the 3 southern provinces, and Great Britain, as usual, would carry off the richest share, the great Yangtze Basin, with perhaps the mineral regions of Henan and Shanxi. This was imperialism, and short-sighted imperialism. It made the Far East in all earnest a storm centre of world politics. It was an extremely important and irritating factor in the relations between England and Germany at the opening of the 20th century. It brought Anglo-Russian rivalry to such a pitch that more than once war was threatened, and England joined with Japan in an alliance, 1902, originally directed against Russian aggression, but subsequently utilised for Japan's own aggrandizement in a most provocative manner. The reaction in China against European imperialism was nothing less than a calamity, as will be explained presently. As far as the United States was concerned, the events of these years, from 1895 to 1900, gave rise to grave concern. American commerce with China and Japan had grown to large proportions, and not without anxiety could the merchant princes engaged in this trade witness the monopolistic tactics of Europe in China. As a faithful solicitor for American business interests, Secretary Hay in 1899 addressed a circular note to the great powers, asking them to respect what is now generally known as the open door principle. Specifically, Hay's celebrated note asked that each power claiming a sphere of interest should pledge itself, 1. Not to interfere with any treaty port or any vested interest in its sphere, 2. To permit the application of the Chinese treaty tariff to ports within its sphere without discrimination against other nations, 3. To maintain equal harbour duties and railway rates for all nationalities. This set of principles shows clearly enough that Hay was interested in American commerce rather than in American investments in the Far East. He was defending commercial equality and ignoring the vital factor, the building of railways, which carried with it the opening of mines and the virtual monopolization of trade in the region traversed by the railways. To Hay's note, Germany, Great Britain, France and Japan agreed, on condition that the other powers do likewise. Italy, not having a sphere of interest, agreed readily enough, but Russia ignored point 3. Hay, however, considered the replies satisfactory and announced that the pledge would be regarded as
final and definitive.
It was anything but final. During the next 2 decades, the Washington government was to give much attention to what Hay had overlooked, namely, the fact that when American capitalists attempted to build railways in China and share in the profits of developing that country, they came up short against a stone wall of monopoly, for the European sphere of interest doctrine meant monopoly of railway and mineral development. Subsection: The Boxers. As regards China, the effects of the leasing of ports and demarcation of spheres of interest were unfortunate in the extreme. On the eve of the scramble for leased ports, the young and impressionable Chinese Emperor Guangxu had issued a series of reform edicts in 1898 in the hope that China would modernize herself no less successfully than Japan. Peking University was to be reorganized on modern lines. Schools and academies were to be opened in the larger cities for instruction in modern European civilization. The civil service examinations, hitherto based on the Chinese classics, were to be revised. Railway and mining development was to be encouraged. The budget was to be balanced and the host of officials reduced in the interest of efficiency and economy. Rash and over-enthusiastic the young Guangxu may have been, but Japan was regenerated by young men, and few great transformations have been achieved without the enthusiasm which scorns tradition and overleaps practical obstacles. However, in addition to the discontent naturally engendered by such reforms, Guangxu suffered in popularity because of the leasing of ports to foreigners, and these elements of opposition were skilfully utilized by an elderly but decidedly vigorous lady, Cixi, Dowager Empress, who had been living in retirement on the Mount of 10,000 Acres. One day in September 1898, this lady firmly seated herself in her sedan chair and ordered her eunuchs to carry her down to the imperial palace. There, with the aid of a treasonous general, Yuan Shikai by name, she seized the emperor, made him acknowledge her as a regent, executed his liberal advisers, cancelled his reform edicts, and set her face against all innovation and all European influence. In particular, an imperial decree of December 18, 1898, announced that no more railway projects would be entertained, for the present, by the Chinese government. The reform movement was nipped in the bud. Worse still, a virulent type of reactionary and anti-European agitation was encouraged, more or less secretly, by the Dowager Empress, and in 1899 there began a series of popular attacks on missionaries and other foreigners. By 1900 the local riots had become an anti-European rebellion, and the European legation quarters in Peking, filled to overflowing with frightened foreigners, were besieged by fanatical Chinese. This was the Boxer Rebellion, or Boxer War, so called because the leadership was taken by a Chinese organization whose name was rather inaccurately translated as the Society of Boxers. The Boxers were not professional pugilists, but patriots, who believed in using force to expel the foreigners. That the Boxers believed themselves invulnerable to European bullets and considered their campaign as a religious war to prevent the desecration of Chinese soil by foreigners and their railways will perhaps indicate the nature of the movement. The law of physics that the reaction is equal to the action was here exemplified in politics. The anti-foreign reaction was as unrestrained as had been the imperialist provocation. The great powers rushed troops to rescue the legations at Peking and to punish the Boxers. Great Britain, Russia, Germany and the United States all contributed small forces, and significantly, Japan was recognised as sufficiently Europeanised to participate in chastising her refractory neighbour. This joint intervention by 5 powers is interesting because it was an example of international cooperation. It had to be that, for no one power would have been permitted by the others to intervene alone. It was also more effective than most punitive expeditions undertaken by a single power. Chinese resistance was speedily crushed, Peking was taken, and the Boxer movement stamped out. The one shameful blot on the record was the looting of Peking by European soldiers, a wholly undesirable object lesson in European ethics. And the punishment of China was unduly severe. It was well enough to execute guilty officials, and to exclude the rebellious districts from civil service examinations for 5 years, and to station legation guards at Peking. But the indemnity of $325 million was unwarrantably heavy. It has been a burden on China from that day to this. The United States, at least, had the grace to assign her share of the indemnity as a fund for the education of Chinese students in America. End of section 3.